We're moving to the central piece of our first part of the day, not to underestimate the input we had from the impulse speeches, but now we're moving into the keynote speech that we have from Ross today. Ross is the deputy head of school and professor of museum technology in the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester in the UK. And exciting times ahead. In 2022, Ross becomes the founding director of the new Research Institute of Digital Culture. So let's follow up on the developments as it's coming into being. But there is another aspect of Ross' identity. He leads one by one an international collaboration of cultural organization, academics and policymakers and professional bodies using action research to help build the digital confidence of museums. So there is plenty of credits that I could go on with explaining what who Ross is, but I think nothing tells better than Ross talking himself. So I won't take more time again, and I will allow Ross to take the stage, and we'll proceed into the discussion after the conversation with Ross.
Olga, thank you so much, and I hope everybody can hear me and see me okay. It's a privilege. I always begin these sorts of presentations and conversations by saying, you know, what a privilege and an honor it is, but it genuinely is. I do mean it sincerely. To see who's in the meeting today and who you had yesterday, who you've managed to assemble for the Doors Incubator project, this network of creatives and technologists and curators and writers and academics who, you know, from many institutions across many countries are all leaning in and are all turning to this same question about technological development, about innovation and change. It is humbling to be asked to be in the room with you and to contribute to this conversation. And my goodness, what a start already! You know, Maretta and Seb's contributions just provide a stunning kind of frame for the conversation going forward. And in a way, they, I'm sort of, standing on their shoulders really, in setting out what I think will probably be a primer, really, a bit of an atlas, maybe a guide, something that will give us a little bit of a roadmap, maybe a lexicon of terms, maybe something that can be a little bit of a mnemonic to just help, well, the pilots and the projects you're part of within Doors, but maybe your ongoing practice as well. In many ways, what I'm going to be talking about, and some of the ideas, or many of the ideas that I'll be kind of presenting, they'll be familiar. I don't think what I'm trying to do here is to surprise with something novel and new, but maybe the innovation is in assembling them in a particular way. So what I'm trying to do is to take not just a step back, but maybe 2 or 3 steps back from everything we've heard this morning already and all that you heard yesterday and that you'll hear more about through the pilot projects, and to see whether we can notice a pattern, to see whether we look up at all of those stars, whether we can see constellations, whether we can start to see shapes and begin to express what the significance of these changes in practice, these changes in ways of thinking, these changes within our digital culture, whether they're linked and whether we can start to understand why those changes have taken place. So in a way, this is a very different conversation over the next 40 minutes. This is not a conversation about getting things done and practice. This isn't a conversation about operational detail and strategic vision. This isn't a conversation about specific projects and procurement and so on. This is probably taking a slightly more philosophical perspective on this discussion. And it's stepping back and thinking about maybe some of the underlying theories, ideologies, politics, and sociological context that might explain or might help us to notice with more confidence and clarity what's going on with museum technology. So I'm playing with 3 words. I'm playing with these words remix, hybridity, and quantum. And in a way, by bringing those together as a bit of a triplet, I'm trying to signal that these voguish terms, these neologisms that we're hearing around in society more widely, but also in our professional practice, that I think there's real significance. These aren't just kind of voguish terms that are gimmicks and exciting to kind of drop as keywords into a presentation or a funding bid or when talking to a board or stakeholders. I think genuinely and honestly, we need to pause and notice the profound significance of what these terms mean, because I think if we trace them back and we start to think what connects them, there are some exciting and fundamental connections. So let's go on a little bit of a journey together then. So what is that change? Well, briefly, I would summarize it in this way. I think why we're doing this work around museum technology, where we're doing it, who's doing it, how we're doing it, and what it produces, all of those things are changing and have changed in the last 5 to 10 years. And it might be worth just noticing that briefly. Once upon a time, when we embarked on projects like the incubator, projects like Doors, where we brought practitioners and researchers and academics and technologists together, what motivated us? What were the principles and values that initiated those projects originally? They were typically technology-centered. This was about looking at a new piece of technology, whether it was mobile or Internet of Things, or actually a long time ago, just the database and the computer, or our ability to scan and digitize. And it was about trying to understand what that technology could do. It was very problem-based. It was very, very much predicated upon technology is progressing. Today, however, the way that we frame our projects, and my goodness, just listen to the way that Moretta so beautifully talked about some of the human-centered and emotive and effective projects that she's leading and she's part of. It's about people now. We're centering people in the human experience and emotion and sensibility within our work. We're not generically talking about the computer. We absolutely try to understand it in your national context, a particular community context, a particular a global north context, or an institutional, one particular organizational context. So we've learned to differentiate now, and our conversations typically around museum technology have that kind of granularity of the institution. And as we do all of this, and we've heard it today in some of the references to well-being and mental health already, and I'm sure this will be an underlying common denominator across many of your projects. We foreground values now. This isn't just about progress and efficiency and interoperability and standardization and systematization with computers. This is about asking fundamentally, well, why? Why do this? Why use a computer to help us with all of this work? So we're driven by values. Consequently, the things that you are producing now, the things that the collaborators in this network are producing, and many others that work in the area of museum technology are producing, they've evolved. Once upon a time, we were producing the handbooks, the guides, the how-to instructions, the directory of terms, the workflow, the process that said this is how systematically and methodically we can deliver this piece of technology. But today, what do? We try and create tools that enable people. The project I'm part of, actually, one by one of its headline tools that it's generated, you're sort of looking at it now. It's a deck of cards. We use the deck of cards to help organizations to understand what digital means to them, in what context they're developing digital, and what aspect of their skills, their competency, their capability, their literacy they're looking to develop. And then what emotionality in their leadership, empathy, mindfulness, collaboration, resilience, do they need to bring to that piece of digital work? So yes, we can write the books, and we will, and we have, and yes, we can produce the guides and the case studies and the data, but for us, it's now about producing useful materials that any individual, any practitioner can use in their space, on their terms, in their way. So the tools have changed. In terms of not just why we're doing this and what gets produced, but in terms of who's been driving the projects, and now today who drives our projects in these new coordinates, as we try and mesh the new coordinates of museum technology, we notice it's a different community than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Once upon a time, it was always the first adopters. It was the IT person that knew how to use that technology, or had been exposed to that new piece of hardware or software, and had a kind of exclusive and sometimes esoteric relationship with that particular device. they were the first adopters. They had an exclusive and higher set of competencies that very few had, and it empowered that smaller group. But today, we see a much more expansive community of interest and practice and expertise that are part of our museum technology projects. And it's reflected in who's in this meeting just today. But look at the organizations, look at the people, look at the guest list, look at who's involved indoors, but start to look also about who writes, who speaks, who has thought leadership, who has agency now in the area of museum technology. And not only is it a range of institutions, but it's a range of people within those institutions. It is the educationalists and the marketeers and the storytellers, as well as the conservators and the technologists. It is leadership and directors, but it's also early career individuals as well. And they're finding a voice through social media and other channels. They're self-assembling and finding new places to build an identity and to create a conversation. And in academic terms, and certainly looking at this as, from a museum studies perspective and a university perspective, we continue to see a diversification in the number of disciplines that become interested in digital, in museum technology and muse tech. It's not just a closed group, a coterie of museum computing experts and enthusiasts now. It's people writing on literature, it's people writing on critical management studies, it's people from creative computing, it's people from digital humanities, it's people from sociology, it's people from design and UX and many different areas. So we have many different allies now. We have many different users and audiences and experts and leaders and thought leaders who are part of this conversation. That has changed. It's a fundamentally important change in the coordinates of how this work gets done and how this conversation gets framed. Likewise, we've moved from particular closed projects, particular framed endeavor with a beginning, middle, and end, an aim, an objective, a delivery, and an endpoint, to actually today our conversation around news tech is much more kind of open. It's much more ongoing. It's much more fluid. In One by One, we have a platform called the Digital Commons, and that's where we discuss. We go off into kind of rooms and we incubate new ideas. We pitch new projects to each other. We share. We're vulnerable. We say what we don't know. We do something in a quick sprint, or we have a much longer, slow burn conversation as well. Things kind of splinter off into different directions and diverge. Occasionally, they converge, and we have a moment of kind of sharing. So that kind of rhythm and formality and very kind of boxed approach of the project is evolved today. We're used to technology conversations to always being on, for us to be able to kind of jump from ice flow to ice flow and listen to different conversations in any one day, and the projects kind of feed into each other and these tracks kind of combine and different networks start to share and connect themselves. So where we do this project, where we do this work is also evolving. And finally, the manner in which it's done. Those closed projects were very experimental. It was about trying to accumulate knowledge. It was about trying to solve the problem. Whereas today, our approach is very different. We start to think as much about the campaigning and the communication and the inclusiveness of our projects, rather than just closing the door and trying to figure out how to get the technology to work. So rather than a very linear and incremental accumulation of knowledge and understanding and best practice, we try things in different directions. They have a more kind of creative flow to them. Many of us are using design thinking, empathizing and defining and ideating and prototyping and testing and sharing, that fantastic design narrative, using that to drive our research now, rather than just those older idioms of just having a hypothesis and then testing it. So look, that's what's changed. There's many different ways of summarizing what's changed and why now is different and why it feels different, why the cadence of our conversation, the register of the conversation, the focal points of our conversation, why they feel so different now. I think it could be because of that shift that's on the screen here, this shift between who, where, why, how, and what's produced within our work. So these new coordinates then, how might we explain them? How might we explain why that shift has taken place? I pick up a rather opaque word, and I want to unpack it because it's not always a clear word, but a word that I carry around as just a quick summary to say, this is why it feels different now. This is why this moment appears to have a different set of drivers, outcomes, places, ways of work. I call it's a post-digital moment. So rather than that moment, 10, 20 years ago, where we were noticing museum technology for the first time, and it was something other, and it was something that was outside the organization that was making its way into our processes, into our skills, into our leadership behaviors, into our vision, into our systems and processes. We had to make the case for technology. We had to explain to stakeholders and leaders and users, the value that digital might have as hardware and software, as content, as subject within our museums. But for more and more organizations now, digital has become an innate function. It's become normalized, and it's normative within the day-to-day operation of the organization. And that might include, finance systems and HR systems and IT systems and estate systems and those usual business systems within the organization, as well as those much higher ideals about how the mission and vision of the organization is predicated upon a digital world, or being part of a network society or a dataful culture. So post-digital is a way of recognizing that the institution's relationship with digital, but equally society's relationship with digital, has profoundly changed within this last generation. Post doesn't mean after digital, it just means this extended, augmented state. It's a way of noticing that we have a different, mature relationship in many organizations with digital today. And that's not to say that every organization must have a mature digital relationship. And that's not to say that every organization eventually will have a mature digital relationship. It's just noticing that this is a characteristic that we're seeing more and more in more of our organizations. To unpack it a little bit in a way that's hopefully a little bit easier for us, there's three other words that could be useful in this primer, this mnemonic, to help us understand these new coordinates of museum technology: maturity, mediatization, and the metamon. Again, pretty scary words in some ways, but it's worth just taking a moment on each of them and just unpacking what's going on there. So I've described that digital maturity, the reason why it feels different, and it is different, and we expect different things from museum technology, is because there has been in so many of our organizations a maturing of the way in which digital is embedded within the vision of the organization, within its expected, within the behaviors and the remits of leadership and leaderful behavior across our organization, the way it drives and is a logic behind many of the systems and processes that we have in our organization, the fact that it's part of the culture, the vocabulary, the skill sets, the role descriptions, the assumptions we can make about the art of the possible within the culture of our organization, and the fact that within our job descriptions and within our day-to-day working lives in the museum, we spend so much of it, as we discussed earlier on, as we're in one of our exercises today, looking at screens, using the network, working with data. It is the currency of our working lives. It is the oxygen that allows the institution to thrive. We've become reliant upon computer technology to run the museum. So that post-digitality recognizes that maturity. And that last sentence I said about reliance, we simply could not have said that 2 generations ago. And that's why technology has such a central role to play in what it is to be museum today. The word mediatization, coming from culture and media studies, communication studies, is really helpful here, I find. Mediatization does a couple of things for us. First of all, it recognizes that the museum finds itself today within a society that more and more is defined and experienced and understood in media terms. What that means is that we're part of many communities today, many cultures today, in which so much of our expression, our identity, our work, our play, our home lives, our transport, our leisure, the way in which we are, the way in which we present ourselves to the world is expressed through data and is expressed through connectivity, through network and technology. Mediatization also says that the means by which that data flows and that network is constructed is ever more being defined by more convergent media. So these platforms starting to blend into one, ever more connectivity between the devices as well, and a pervasiveness of our applications and software across those converging media and those connected devices. And finally, mediatization not only says that we express ourselves and we use data in the network, and that networked nature of society, that platform nature of society is ever growing, but it also says that we express ourselves in media terms. The public imaginary, the discourse, the metaphor, the idiom that we reach for is ever more defined and shaped by technology and by media terms. And any historian of science and technology and media knows that it was forever so. You know, looking back through centuries of history of human beings finding ways to communicate, finding ways to order knowledge, finding ways to shape the world around them through technology, that those technologies become embedded within the imaginary, within the poetry, within the visual language, within the ways in which we express ourselves. And in a modern network society, digital society, digital and media is becoming embedded, impregnated, percolating through the way we express ourselves. So mediatization says all of that we need to recognize that we're in a world in which media has this defining characteristic in the way that human beings increasingly express themselves. But mediatization also notices that the museum itself is a unique mediatized landscape. This sense in which there are very few institutions that have the stack of media that the museum has. There are many few places that we go to in our lives that are so media rich and are so dependent on so many different media landscapes and environments as the museum. So mediatization says not only is media and technology a useful way, a lens through which to understand how society works today, but actually it's a powerful way of understanding what the museum is. Once upon a time, when we used to write about what is a museum, and the very beginning of museum studies and museology in the 1960s, it was about objects, it was about collecting, it was about things, and the theories that we reached for were about artifacts and documentation and materiality and naming things. Through the 80s and 90s, the fundamental philosophies that drove museum studies and then started to affect the language of our policymakers as well and our strategies in museums was learning, was education. And suddenly we couldn't see beyond the museum being anything else but a learning organization. And consequently, it was theories and philosophies of learning and communication and knowledge construction that really shaped and really drove the direction of museological research for 10, 20 years. What we're noticing now, and this is another reason why it feels different today, is that those scholars are now reaching for media theories. They're reaching for communication studies. They're starting to work from a discussion not about the thingness of things and materiality and physicality. They're not starting their ways of working thinking about representation and individuals and how we learn and how we express and interpret, but they're starting to think not in terms of kind of knowledge or power, but actually in terms of reality and what is it to represent something. So there's a fundamental shift that's going on within museology as well. And just to dig even deeper, I did say that this would get a little bit philosophical, but it's, that's what we get to do in these sorts of conversations. We can create a clearing in the wood, look at each other and sit around the campfire and try and have a conversation. I feel there's another dimension here, and it's meta-modernity. In a philosophical sense, we are in many discourses around the world today experiencing a different way of engaging with fundamental questions of the human condition. In a Western European philosophical tradition specifically, that modernist philosophical project of the 20th century about systematically wanting to understand the fundamental structures that might help us to see the world and to organize the world, that were then flipped and challenged by the cynicism and puckish behavior and playfulness of postmodernity, that wanted to start kind of turning things over and asking things in a more skeptical way. Today, we find ourselves politically, ideologically, artistically, culturally stepping aside, or at least pushing some of those postmodern cynicism behind us, and a different way of articulating starting to emerge. And some people call this a meta-modern condition. And what it is, it takes that hopefulness of the 20th century modernists that says, we can know, we can figure this out, we can build a database that can put all museum objects on it. The computer can help the museum, to that second generation of starting to question, well, if we do put everything on a computer, is it still a museum? If we put things on a screen, will people ever come? If it's an image of an artwork on a monitor, is that really an artwork, or is it just pixelation? And actually, is the virtual anything close to being real and having an erratic, emotive resonance for the visitor? To then, after that hopefulness and then that skepticism, or after that sincerity and that skepticism, the meta-modern position says, why don't we do both? Why don't we hopefully try and make a good society? Why don't we work together? Why don't we not just undermine and be cynical and skeptical and challenge and decide in a nihilistic way that digital will undermine the museum? Why don't we say it can augment and extend and enhance and take us to somewhere new? But let's use a postmodern critique and lens that will enable us to ask the good questions and sometimes ask difficult questions and allow us to keep questioning. So the post-digital is also about us taking a meta-modern position as well, where we have that sincerity of modernity, that skepticism and questioningness of post-modernity, but we combine it into a new hopefulness where we have a criticality around our collective endeavor with digital. That's why it feels different. It feels different today because our organizations are mature with technology. We are expressing and imagining and talking about technology and digital in a routine day-to-day way. And actually, more widely and philosophically, we're noticing in our politics, we're noticing in our ideologies, we're noticing in the way that we shift and converse around not just the museum, but society more generally, we're noticing a shift as well. I think those come together into something called the post-digital. Okay, so that's us noticing a change. So those shift in those cards on who's doing it, why they're doing it, where they're doing it, how they're doing it, and what they're producing. That's helped us to notice that there may be something quite profound behind all of this, that actually for us to understand museum technology work, we have to pull the camera back a long way, and we have to notice a much more wider societal and philosophical context. But what does this mean practically? What are we noticing then day to day for you in your museums and on these projects indoors as well, within these incubator ideas? What might you find yourself saying? What are the ideas, the hooks, the principles that are going to help you to drive some of these projects? Well, I'd like to suggest 4 things. So if we think about really helpful kind of north, south, east and west way of creating our different axes. So let's think about objects. Let's think about different types of interaction. Let's think about experience. And let's think about interpretation. If we notice what's changing within the way that we work with objects, the way that we manage collections, the way that we build documentation, I think the shift we're seeing, and a word that you'll have noticed quite a lot, and I think we even heard it today, this morning, is that we're used today to not seeing our objects and our collections and our records in fixed, stable, immutable places. We're used now, and my goodness, thinking of just those glorious examples that Seb was sharing, we're used to remixing, we're used to splicing, we're used to adding a mod, we're used to mashing up, we're used to mixing in different ways. We're used to now seeing our collections as notes in a musical scale for us to compose in so many different ways. We're comfortable with our collections suddenly being reassembled in surprising and creative and poetic kind of arrays. We're used to taking our collections out of their strict stratigraphy or their Linnaean hierarchies or their precise timelines. We're used to allowing them to be a metaphor or a prop, or to turn them around, or to push them inside out, or to enable ourselves to edit and reorder. Our job is not to preserve the integrity and fix and freeze the object, but to see it as an inspiration, the beginning of something, a composition, a new assembly, some sort of remix, a collage. So today, the museum isn't the fixed array, it's a fluid collage of possibility that's always in motion. That's different. That's why it feels different today. Equally, that traditional bilateral discourse between author and audience, curator and user, we're used today now of disrupting that. Loretta's wonderful examples of user-generated content, crowdsourcing, co-production, co-creation, this idea of a community of interest with equal agency, assembling in the museum and creating together, that participatory expectation that we have now in the museum. That is innate. To say museum is to imagine a group of people working together in different ways, all having agency, all belonging, and all being inclusive. We don't notice now, we don't recognize now that very bilateral relationship. We instead welcome and encourage and support conversations that maybe the museum doesn't get to initiate. Maybe conversations that the museum has to learn to join, maybe conversations and activities that happen away from the museum in spaces and platforms that it does not have the authority and it doesn't have executive control over, but actually it needs to ask permission to join, and maybe it can contribute, and maybe it can listen, and maybe it can learn. We're used today, therefore, to there being and a difficult word, but a trans-discursive register. So not just a register, a pitch of voices from one person to another, or the museum to its audiences or users or learners or customers, and that very kind of othering dynamic, but actually noticing that there are many discussions happening in many directions simultaneously, and some of them cut across, work through the traditional discourses that we have in the museum, hence trans-discursive. That's why it feels and sounds different today, because those traditional lines of communication have started to fade away, and we've grown to be more comfortable with that trans-discursive environment around, inside, next to, beyond the museum. A couple more. The museum was already evolving in terms of the number of channels. It had already evolved from being just a building to a building that then had outreach, to being a building that had outreach and publication and touring exhibitions and friends societies, to then being a museum that had a building and outreach to online, and suddenly a website and a platform through which visitors around the world with internet connectivity could have a museum experience, to the museum being a building to outreach, to a website, to mobile, where we're in the hand of the museum, of the visitor or the user, wherever they are, on their terms, in their world. We've been used to the museum becoming a multi-channel organization, and for us to start thinking about sort of cross-platform production and not seeing the institution as just a piece of architecture, but seeing and a venue and a place, but by seeing it as a service, seeing it as a brand, seeing it as an organization that can manifest itself in many different channels, through many different channels. But something different's happened in the last few years. Our vocabulary that talks about the multi-channel museum and that multi-channel mode of delivery, it's been extended by this word that we simply weren't using 3 or 4 years ago, maybe even 2 years ago. And that's this hybrid word. let's just take a little bit of a sidebar here and a little bit of a timeout and just reflect upon what we mean by hybrid. I find it a fascinating term because the word I'm seeing being used in several different contexts. We're noticing the same thing. We're noticing the fact that a museum experience or a piece of museum programming or some museum provision may be happening across many different media or channels or platforms or ways of experiencing at the same time. But sometimes we've been conflating many different things underneath that word. So what I've just done here on this little kind of prompt card is to just to suggest a way of maybe just pulling out different versions of hybridity that we're kind of just noticing around us in the sector at the moment. Let me explain what I mean. I think there's different forms of hybridity, as maturity, as mixing, as blending and diversifying. When I say hybridity as a maturity, I think this is those examples when a museum has, as part of that evolution of from building to outreach to website to mobile, actually is starting to think about other ways in which, the mobile phone can be brought back into the museum and there's an augmented reality experience, or there's an AR experience on the streets around the city of the museum, and so on and so on. Or perhaps maybe there's a way in which a lecture is being streamed and so on and so on. So this is hybrid as, we're starting to continue that extension of the channels, the multi-channel nature of the museum. But then I think there's a different form of hybridity that we sometimes hear, and this happens particularly in our art galleries and creative spaces where creatives are really pressing and pushing on the new formats and new forms of communication and artistic expression. And this is about a hybridity that is itself creative. And this is about us as a sector and the creatives within it, thinking about a digital, non-digital form of communication that is genuinely distinct, a kind of mixed reality experience, an XR experience, an MR experience that is genuinely different to what we've seen before. So this may be, many individuals using many different media at the same time, or many different individuals in many different locations having different forms of experience around the same kind of subject or content. It's an example of the museum inventing. It's an example of the museum wanting to innovate in the modes of interaction. I think that's different to what museums did to adapt in an expedient way to the pivot to digital within COVID. That moment when museums closed down and had to spin and had to turn to online provision, that was different. That was the museum in crisis management needing to adapt and find other ways of providing an exhibition experience or an educational resource or continuing a social media relationship and so on, or providing a research resource or repository. It probably had many of the same characteristics, people interacting with the museum online, maybe some people still being able to physically attach and connect to the museum, but it has a different motivation. Finally, there's another way in which we're hearing that hybrid word being used. And I think the motivation here is much more about inclusivity and access. This is about using maybe the lessons learned from COVID, maybe the maturity of noticing how our museum's becoming more multi-channel, and maybe even learning from and being inspired by the creativity of that new mixing form of hybridity. But this is about the museum saying, we should think about our communication channels. We should think about the different means through which, the different sensory means through which individuals experience the museum. So this is starting to think and listen much, much harder about, well, people like me who have a visual impairment, who have very different experiences when I go to museums, probably to many of you, because I see differently. So this is the museum using that word hybridity to think about how can we present a multi-sensory experience that will allow any visitor to encounter the museum and meet the museum on their own sensory terms. That's different from a hybrid creative experience or pivoting to digital. So end of sidebar, just starting to notice that those evolutions of the word hybrid and how that word hybrid is being used, but sometimes being used in different ways. let's complete our discussion and complete our kind of summary here by thinking about finally a question around how we think, a question around how the assumptions that we make about the objects and the items that we have in our museum. If we think about the traditional discourse around museum technology, it's typically, habitually set up digital against non-digital, the virtual against the real, the computer against the material. We have all too often wrestled with questions and anxieties around, will this work online? Will this be engaging on a screen? Is this still emotive and exciting and full of wonder and awe when it's pixelated? Is there a value for a museum that is predicated on being this fantastic social, physical, architectural experience when we're offering it through the screen of someone's phone in one tweet? We've spent so much of our time reflecting upon this duality and seeing the world of museum technology in a very binary and dualistic way. What we're noticing are the very beginnings of a very different way of reasoning. So just as today we're getting comfortable starting to think in terms of remix rather than reticulated collections, and just as we're getting comfortable to think of talking and working within and seeing around us, transdiscursive conversations rather than bilateral ones. And just as we're getting more and more comfortable with many different types of blends and mixes of hybridity, there's another thing heading our way. Now, the European Union in its current research says we're not going to see this till 2035, but let's see. When will that first quantum computer sit on someone's desk? I think there's something really interesting happening around this idea of quantum computing and quantum logic. So it's this basic idea from it's this incredibly challenging and complex idea from physics that says, if we think about quantum mechanics and we think about, light being both a particle and a wave, and the almost paradox idea that something in the world, physically in the world, can be one thing and another thing simultaneously. That logic, that mechanics, that set of physical laws are powering new experimental types of computing technology that will change the way that computers work in the 21st century. In our lifetime, we will see quantum computers that will be faster, but more importantly, they will be predicated on a completely different fundamental logic. So rather than the silicon chip, semiconductor, on, off, yes, no, 1, 0, and everything in the computer always needing to be in one state or another, the quantum computer can allow things to be in different states at the same time. And it's a perturbing idea. It feels like a paradox. This superpositioning of ideas where something can be two things, perhaps contradictory things at the same time, means that the logic of the computer is fundamentally different. So I'm interested in not just what will that impact of that technology be on society and the museum when it comes, not just on how does the museum collect quantum, how does the museum collect quantum computing, but I'm also interested in what does that reasoning do to us as human beings, and what does it do to us as museum practitioners? Because, and stay with me on this, because in the middle of the 20th century, it was computing logic, binary logic, hierarchical database logic that systematically steered the way that museums came up with their whole classification systems and collection management systems that we still use 50 years later. We can see how computing technology has shaped the reasoning of our knowledge management and information management and collections management within the museum. When the logic of that technology changes and it's no longer hierarchical, It's no longer about exclusively putting one element in one cell. It's no longer about deciding yes, no, true, false, which keyword, but actually it allows for paradox. It allows for something to be both true and false at the same time. It allows for something to be in multiple states concurrently and equally. What does that do to our fundamental reasoning of classifying an object when it comes into the institution, where there aren't the same requirements on decision making at that knowledge capture moment? It's a long way off. It's only just starting to happen, but it will be a fundamental new coordinate of museum technology. Aware of time, I'm just going to bring us home. This idea then that in terms of the remix collage, it's never finalized. The register is never finished. Hybridity, it's neither offline or online. It's both. It's something new. And quantum logic is both true and false. Maybe a neater way of summarizing all of those would be to say, we're talking about objects that remain in motion. We're talking about interactions that are ongoing. We're talking about experiences that happen at once. And we're talking about interpretation that isn't paradox and a duality, but it is as one. The new coordinates of museum technology will be about understanding things in motion, ongoing, at once, and as one. A final comment. What I think is also interesting is that the theories, the conceptual frameworks that we will need, and we're already beginning to see that we need to understand these new coordinates of museum technology, they're very different set of philosophical shapes. I'm seeing my students, I'm seeing co-researchers now use these sorts of theoretical frameworks that we simply didn't see 10 years ago within our subject. We're seeing museum technology practitioners and researchers and other museologists using grounded theory, where they go into the field with an open mind and respond to what they see, not deductively walking into the field with a set of assumptions. They use systems thinking. They want to understand expansively, the widest possible sense, how all elements in front of them are connected. They use actor network theory, which isn't just taking one snapshot or trying to build one particular timeline. They're able to use ANT to map and trace and follow complexity in the world around them. A new materialism and a post-human way of working that enables practitioners now to not make this about just human beings, but actually to understand the world that puts nature at the center, environment at the center, or on equal terms with human beings, and possibly even the technology itself at the center, a post-human approach which takes a non-anthropocentric approach to technology. These are the new tools, these are the new words, these are the new concepts that our sector uses today. A final sentence. In 1999, Stephen Weil wrote, practitioner, director, and museologist, wrote a very famous piece of work that said, in a way that's so kind of iconic, really, a wonderful summary of what had happened to museum practice in the last sort of few decades, that you can see it here. The museum moving from being about something to being for somebody. A really lovely way of summarizing that for so long, museums were about collections and the object. But then what happened in the new museology is that we started to think about actually who's this for? And we centered the audience and things became visitor orientated. So with our new set of words, is it time to take Stephen Weil's syllogism a little bit further? In a world that's about remixing, a world that's going to be about trans-discursive ways of communicating, in a world that's going to be more and more hybrid, and a world that's going to be shaped by quantum thinking and quantum working, will the museum not be about something or being for somebody? Will it actually be about museums or starting to think about being somewhere and somehow? So this is about us starting to think that the museum somewhere, in whatever form it needs to take, and somehow through whatever means it will offer that provision, will reflect upon the human condition as it's always done. Thank you so much.